Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marcin Terlikowski, and I have the privilege to moderate yet another PISM, Polish Institute of International Affairs online conference, which will focus today on the topic of Russia. Our topic is Wounded Bear, how the Russian security policy will look like after the COVID-19 pandemic. Speaking of myself, I have been defense analyst with PISM, head of international security program here in the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And it's really a privilege for me to moderate, to run this conference today. And it's a particular privilege because we managed to get a great lineup of speakers today, starting with Keir Giles, who is a renowned expert of Russia on the matters of Russian foreign and security policy, on the matters of Russian internal policy. So I'm very happy to have Keir with us today. Keir, of course, is with the Chatham House, so he's online with us from UK. Hopefully the connection will be stable despite some severe weather around Warsaw and in some parts of Europe. But next in line, we have Anna Maria Dyner, who is a defense expert of PISM, focusing on Russian security and defense policy and on the internal, let's say, defense aspects of Russian modernization program, of Russian transformation of the armed forces. And definitely last but not least, Łukasz Kulesa, deputy head of research in the Polish Institute of International Affairs, but also a renowned expert on arms control, non-proliferation, deterrence, and nuclear weapons, also with a big chunk of his career with the Polish administration, with the presidential office. So it's a pleasure to have a great lineup of speakers. I know that some of you have seen the original program when we had a Russian speaker, Ruslan Pukhov, who was meant to be with us, but he couldn't make it. That was just a last-minute development. He's otherwise fine, but some other commitments made him prevented him from participating in today's seminar. The way how we will proceed today is very typical. We will have like 10-12 minutes introductions by the three speakers. Then we will try to have some interaction between you guys. So I encourage you to also react to what you will hear from your counterparts. But at the same time, those of you who are logged into the YouTube are able to post questions into the chat box, which is next to the screen. I will read these questions on your behalf, so please try to be specific about what you ask, what you would like to ask the speakers, and hopefully this will make our discussion even more interesting. But without further ado, I would like to give the virtual floor to Keir to kick us off with some initial remarks on precisely the topic, how the COVID-19 pandemic is influencing Russia in everyday's life, in its approach to foreign policy, to security policy, and will Russia be different after the COVID-19 pandemic? Will this wounded bear roar more dangerously, or maybe it will become more like a teddy bear, more likely to get along with the West and its neighbors? Keir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcin. Good afternoon, everybody. Of course, there's option C, which is Russia continues exactly as it did beforehand, and the pandemic doesn't actually make any difference to either postures or actions afterwards. In fact, it's come as a bit of a surprise to some people that Russia hasn't taken more advantage of the current situation. People were expecting Russia to make use of the fact that the West was distracted and preoccupied in order to advance some foreign policy games. But in fact, we've seen not a lot new from Russia. Russia has carried on doing what it does. Existing processes have continued to take over, and all the recent news of Russian actions which the West disapproves of, for example, the taking hostage of Paul Whelan in Moscow, are all the results of long processes that were set in place long before the pandemic actually started. In the military domain, initially there was a certain amount of excitement at early stages because there was an apparent uptick in Russian military activity, particularly air activity, flights towards Northern Europe or US airspace in March and April. But again, it was stuff that would have happened anyway. It was Russia paying close attention to US submarine exercises or its own long-planned submarine activities. And there were expectations that disinformation and information warfare exploitation would step up, given that the pandemic provided a situation where fear and uncertainty and doubt were already prevalent throughout Western populations. Then they didn't have to be manufactured for Russian aims. But again, despite what looked like an early charm offensive, that has not materialized largely. There was in the early stages an attempt by Russia to make use of the situation. We saw so-called aid to Italy and to the United States, a two-track approach parallel with disinformation, looking for sanctions relief and to extract maximum concessions while the West was distracted and divided, and also positioning Russia as a responsible, non-threatening actor, as an alternative, for example, to the EU in Europe, trying to gain trust among populations, circumventing governments and directly reaching out to people. But those early campaigns didn't last long. Those attempts to take advantage were unsuccessful, it seems. In fact, they provided a case study of how Russia doesn't do soft power. It backfired. The shipment of faulty equipment to Italy and then threatening personally media who report on the fact that it's faulty was just a case study of how Russia is not very good at that kind of outreach. And the Russian disadvantage, of course, relative to the West in terms of delivering soft power is eroding now that the United States in particular is torpedoing its own soft power advantages relative to the rest of the world. But it's still the case that this is not a talent that comes naturally to Russia. In fact, all of the Russian speakers listening and will know that you cannot even translate soft power into Russian. It comes across as soft force with an entirely different meaning. So it was expected that Russia would exploit, first of all, the coronavirus pandemic, and then all of the subsequent crises that have emerged, like Black Lives Matter, like protests in the United States and Europe, like statue wars. But it seems that the covert disinformation activity that was expected hasn't materialized. Why? Well, in part because Russia doesn't need to make stuff up at the moment. You don't need to seed false narratives when Western societies already contain their own toxic super spreaders of disinformation who are doing it of their own accord, including authority figures. Now, what Russian disinformation activity would have come up with a narrative as wild as, yes, everybody should inject bleach in order to deal with coronavirus. It's just not necessary when all of this is pre-manufactured by the societies they're targeting. And unlike Russia's previous involvement in the United States, for example, you don't need to start a fight over race in the United States or over culture and history in the UK and across Europe if people are doing it anyway. So instead, what we've seen, instead of covert measures, it's actually entirely overt. It comes across in state media. And for example, Vladimir Putin, for once, when he says that Western societies are in, quote, deep internal crisis, unquote, he's not making it up. Russian disinformation doesn't need to paint a picture of dysfunctional government that's out of touch with its society, of deep social schisms, and of Western institutions that have lost their way, including police forces, when each of these is demonstrating that perfectly satisfactorily of their own accord without any external assistance. Now, there are limitations to what we as open source researchers can see in terms of what Russia is actually doing, especially on a tactical level. Sometimes we just don't have the visibility as to what's going on. For example, in activities run against NATO's forward presence, the enhanced forward presence in Poland and the Baltic states. What we see is fragmentary and anecdotal because so much of it happens under the surface, and it's hard to get the whole story of activities that may be being run against NATO allies on a day-to-day basis. But what we see in the broader military sense, Russia's attempts at visible positioning for after the pandemic, also would have happened anyway without the current situation. For example, having a stake in Libya is even more important to Russia than other countries where it seeks to expand its presence and its influence because of all the multiple leverages that a presence there would give. Its oil, its migrant flows, its security, its potential for basing A-to-AD assets or electronic warfare, all of which have the potential, if leveraged, to seriously complicate NATO's positions. So all of these expectations of assertive exploitation of the current crisis by Russia didn't seem to come to fruition. And you have to ask yourself, why not? Well, partly, of course, because Russia's own internal distractions will be keeping it busy. There's the run-up to the constitution vote on the 1st of July. There's also economic pressures as well as what's going on in healthcare. Russia, as a general rule of thumb, is more assertive when it's wealthy, when it's flush with cash, when energy revenues give it that room to exert itself without being too concerned about the consequences. But coronavirus poses an additional challenge to the economy on top of it being so recently torpedoed by the collapse in the energy prices. And also, let's not forget that Russia does not always by default manufacture crises. It might ride them for maximum benefit. It might intervene to stop them getting worse by Russian security criteria, but it is less likely, relatively speaking, to destabilize situations for no reason. Russia, as much as any other country, likes stability and likes predictable outcomes. And the pandemic, by its very nature, makes things unpredictable and gives a high risk of failure. And that aversion to high risk of failure you can see in the behaviors of, for example, President Putin, distancing himself from the antivirus efforts, letting his layers of administration and regional governors take the responsibility for what's going on in dealing with the crisis in order to deflect criticism from Putin himself. But that doesn't mean that Russian opportunism and willingness to seize the moment will be reduced. This will still be a factor as Russia is recovering, as the West is recovering in this long-term pandemic process, because Russia will still be there with still the same security concerns, watching developments with the same amount of alarm and no less delusion as to the hostile intent of the West overall. So even if we see nothing new, we should expect a continuation of the diplomatic and undiplomatic campaigns against the West. That will continue, and Russia will still exploit Western vacuums of will or of presence if the perceived cost of not acting is high enough, as it was, for example, in Ukraine and in Syria, where Russia saw a situation developing in an entirely different way to how it was perceived in the West, and felt that it had to stop this happening and to step in order to arrest the decline and things becoming more dangerous. In short, we shouldn't assume, even at times like this, that Russia will default to use of a crisis in order to cause major disruption. But at the same time, as we emerge from this problem, we shouldn't be any less aware of Russia's attitudes and assumptions and of the potential to do harm in ways which the West may not necessarily anticipate or expect. Marcin, back to you.
Thank you, Keir. That was very interesting. Now, you said something interesting, a lot of interesting things, but the one issue I picked up is that Russia is very self-assertive and probably causing more damage in its neighborhood and beyond when it is wealthy. And now with the prices of oil really low, and with the effects, economic effects of the pandemics, they do not really have that big reserves of capital. So that would suggest they would probably reshuffle their priorities as regards both foreign policy but also defense policy. So I would like to use this as a link to our next speaker, to Anna, with a very broad question. If this is the case, if Russia has less and less money because of pandemic, because of the oil prices, because of the internal needs, then will it change the general directions, the trends, or the assumptions in its state rearmament program and in its plans of the transformation of its military forces, or will it pursue them regardless of the gaps it will create in other areas, in healthcare or education systems? Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcin, very much. Thank you, Keir, for your very interesting speech. I won't agree totally that it's only wealthy Russia which tries to focus on its neighbors or someone else. There were some visible situation where it didn't function like this. But nevertheless, nowadays we are thinking about what will be the future of Russian security policy, taking into account the economic crisis, partially caused by the pandemic, partially caused by the lower price of gas and oil. And I will put it like that: when I listened to the last interviews given by Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu, he's always stressing that the military budget will be the last one, which will be cut during the pandemic, during the crisis. Probably it will be, but coming back to your marching questions about how it will look like and how it will influence rearmament programs and all what is going on in Russia. Just coming back to some data. Last year, in 2019, Russia spends about almost 4% of its GDP into the military budget. This year, probably more or less the share will be the same. We shall see if the situation with the budgetary crisis will be very deep in Russia. However, still we can observe that nothing was stopped during the pandemic. First of all, Russia just a little bit stops its military drills and exercises in the country, but if we see the data from just this month, from June, we can be pretty sure that the number of them is rising. It's first thing. Second thing is that Russians were very proud that they almost didn't stop the production and modernization of military equipment during the pandemic. There were even some information that it was maintained on more or less 80% of everyday level of the production. Nowadays, we also are waiting for the military victory parade in Moscow and some other Russian cities, which is also not only a historic issue, but also a military one. And probably we will see plenty of maybe not very new, but modernized kind of equipment. And it was also very interesting to observe that during the pandemic, the Russian armed forces almost didn't stop they practicing to this parade. Moreover, during the pandemic, Russian armed forces were used as a healthcare. They built some hospitals. They were sent, as Keir mentioned, not only to Italy but also to Serbia and to some other places. So on this, I mean, the pandemic didn't change also the perception of threats of Russia. We can see this huge number of drills and exercises, especially in western and northern part of the country, which shows that still Russia perceives NATO as a main military threat, even if we have plenty of problems with healthcare and some other issues. It's one thing. The second thing is that they published first in public the military nuclear doctrine, which was also a very visible issue, showing that Russia is very carefully focusing on what is going on in NATO, because the timing of the publishing wasn't unexpected. It was just the right answer for what is going on in NATO, about the discussion about the nuclear sharing, the discussion about how to say, maybe not the discussion about the US and Germany, but the whole problems with both sides. And third issue, how to deal with post-INF world. So moreover, we can also say that the publishing of this new nuclear doctrine shows very well that still NATO and the US especially is perceived as a main military threat. Moreover, we have plenty of exercises, as I said, in Western and North, which are directly answer to NATO, what is doing by NATO. Nowadays, the Defender is up to end, so we also see what will be the answer from the Russian side. But believe me or not, I'm pretty sure that they will answer it during this year's biggest military drills in Southern Military District, Caucasus to 2020. And also will be very interesting to see what will be the scenario of these drills, how Russia will use all those military stuff which it put to annex Crimea, what will be going on on the Black Sea. So I'm pretty sure, coming back to the first question, that Russia didn't change its perception of the threats. First of all, is NATO. First of all, is the US. First of all, is everything what is going on in NATO eastern flank. Russia will try to respond it. Russia will try to maintain its military budget, also because of some internal issues, but maybe we'll come back to this in the future. And Russia still will focus on plenty of modernization projects, especially in the field of nuclear weapons, but also with main battle tanks, with aircraft, and so far so on, just to use their own capacities to be ready, how to say, to answer all of threats in their perception and coming directly from NATO. Thank you, Marcin.
Thank you, Anna. So basically, we may expect more of the same, although in different circumstances. There is one aspect which you mentioned, referring to the, let's say, the post-INF war. So the issue of arms control and the role the new Russian missile capabilities play in the, let's say, also diplomatic and military game which Russia is playing with US and NATO. I mean, there are suggestions, and there are people who claim that less strong Russia, which is experiencing problems after the pandemic, and which is struggling to keep up with the modernization, even if all these plans which you mentioned are formally upheld, will be more keen to actually offer something constructive with regards to arms control, with regards to relations to NATO, that it won't be the game we know, we used to know for long, both in NATO Russia Council, in the OSCE, in the so-called structured dialogue, and on other forums, that Russia is actually not interested into giving anything, any concessions, any real steps to build trust with the West. So of course we will not, it will be difficult to guess today, but we have a perfect person to try to answer this question or show us the parameters or the factors driving this question. So Łukasz Kulesa, our top expert on nuclear deterrence and arms control disarmament. The floor is yours, Łukasz.
Thank you very much, Marcin. And it's a difficult thing to follow after two great introductions. Luckily, you will find some points on which I would put the accent in a slightly different place than Keir and Anna, because the continuation is in a sense, it's a safe bet. That it's more or less the same since the threat perception in Russia doesn't change that much, and the capabilities also, they don't really change rapidly in Russia and also in other countries. But I still see the perspective of the game of the Russian security policy being played slightly differently than it's been played before the pandemics. The Wounded Bear title probably with a question mark, and of course, you know, we here we're very stereotypical in our title and imaginary about Russia. But I think it's worth to highlight that it's still an ongoing crisis, both in Russia and in other countries that are suffering from the pandemics. And I've seen a lot of predictions about the impact on Russian political system, on Russian society, also on Russian economy. But there is a lot of what we don't know. Would there be, is the first wave really overcome, as the Russian leadership would want us to believe, and it would like its all citizens to believe, or even if it's overcome, what about the second and potentially the third wave? So I think the Russian leadership, as the leadership of most other countries, including ours, cannot really be sure how Russia would fare under the COVID crisis, which also has the consequences for the foreign and security policy. And it's also good to highlight that first of all, Russia is not the source of all evil in the world, and I feel Keir was right to point it out. But also, secondly, that we should be careful not to treat the behavior of Russia in the field of security and the field of military development as something very peculiar or something very, very strange. Because you have a number of other countries that are still trying to adjust the functioning of the armed forces to the pandemics situation. And I think that also concerns the training, the activity, the force posture, some of the signaling that we are seeing. And I always see it as a kind of dual track policy of Russia, which is also related to kind of dual track narrative. So one track is NATO and the United States as an enemy, and therefore explanation for the force posture, for the security doctrine, for force deployments, for exercises, including the major exercises like the Zapad series or the big unplanned exercises. But there is always a second narrative, which is about Russia that is constructive and the partners which are not constructive. And Russia coming up with all sorts of proposals, including in the area of arms control and confidence building measures, and others, first and foremost NATO, not really ready to take action. And we see both these narratives being played during the crisis. We see the narrative of deterrence, which I think Anya described what's going on. This also includes some muscle flexing. We've seen the patrols of the strategic aviation. We've seen in April one episode that the Americans decided to make public, in which for more than 40 minutes, a Russian fighter was interfering with the Poseidon patrol/surveillance aircraft somewhere in the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, in behavior that the Americans describe as unprofessional and unsafe. So a lot of muscle flexing. The publication of the nuclear deterrence principle is also part of the muscle flexing. I also suspect that the 24th parades would also be the muscle flexing. But there is also ongoing efforts to be nice. Keir said that it started early, didn't really work, and it's right now slightly abandoned. I see the efforts on the Russian side to actually continue with some ideas. There is the old idea of the missile deployment moratorium that is reminded from time to time, But there is also a relatively new idea, which Minister Lavrov called mir, so peace in Russian, but also military initiative for restraint. No major military activities by NATO and by Russia along the borders, and the Russians pledged that there would be no large-scale exercises along the border with NATO, which is pretty convenient because the only large-scale exercises, Kafkas, are actually planned to be somehow further from the borders. Let's see how far they manage to go to the Black Sea. So there is this one, and Lavrov sent a letter to Stoltenberg, so made this proposal official, and apparently they are still waiting for the kind of proper reply. The third issue is that, of course, they are taking advantage of some of the latest developments around the Open Skies Treaty, where some experts were predicting that the Russians would use the opportunity to also withdraw from the treaty, but so far they have taken a different road, which is to say that the United States is bad, Russians and others are good, and therefore they're supposed to save this treaty together. And their main concern of the Russians is about the state of European security and about this danger that the remaining NATO countries in the treaty would share the data with the United States when it's out. So there are proposals, and there is also a kind of rejection of the way that the relationship with NATO was conducted so far. Deputy Foreign Minister Grushko said recently that there is no sense to have a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council because NATO insists that it always starts with discussing Ukraine and what Ukraine has to do with NATO-Russia relations. So NATO keep up and come up with a better agenda. And I think the Russians would be using some of the openings, such as the debate about nuclear sharing in Germany, or indeed the decisions about the US troops in Europe. So all of this points me to saying that there might be a situation in which actually Russians would bring on engagement track much stronger than before. It would be packed most likely with this general narrative that right now under pandemics, we should all focus on being together and saving the humanity. And that may also mean some limitations of kind of more assertive actions on the Russian side. In some instances, basically making a virtue out of necessity. So because they would focus on the internal situation anyway, why not selling it as an olive branch or concession or attempt to be cooperative? So I think this is where we are. Another angle that we may come back to it during the discussion is, of course, waiting for the U.S. presidential elections and for the outcome of the U.S. Presidential elections, and also shaping the Russian foreign and security policy on the basis of the outcome of the elections. But I see the possibility not of a genuine change that Marcin, you talked about, kind of Russia moving on some of these things that we wanted to move, but an attempt to look into the possibility of getting what Russia wants through engagement and through initiatives rather than through military exercises or saber rattling.
Thank you, Łukasz. Thank you all. You have been very generous for our audience because you only took half an hour, which leaves us with around 60 minutes more for discussing all these issues. So I encourage all of you who are listening and watching us on YouTube to post questions on in the chat box. If you can't do it, you have to log into your YouTube account, so you can actually write in the chat box. In the meantime, however, I'd like to prompt you to dwell more on one issue which was touched here. You mentioned Ukraine and the Russian approach to Ukraine. So there is, of course, the question about what next for Donbas, not to mention Crimea. But there is also a question of other so-called frozen conflicts. So Georgia, Transnistria, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, so the Nagorno-Karabakh issue. Do you feel that the current situation in Russia, that maybe the trends which you, Łukasz, mentioned, so a kind of selling engagement part by Russia as a new normal, maybe not a new normal, but something what will prevail over a confrontational course, which we have seen recently over the last year or two, especially, that this kind of being nice to the West may actually change the situation in some of these areas. Speaking about Donbas, speaking about Transnistria, maybe Abkhazia, South Ossetia, there are different actions taken, as you know. Can Russia easily make some concessions there to complement to this picture of more engagement with the West? So I don't know who would like to refer to that. You can just make me a sign. Keir, I can see you're unmuting.
You saw me twitching, yes. Yeah, certainly. I do take issue with the notion that Russia will be weaker and therefore more inclined to make concessions on any of these issues. I don't see anything that leads us to believe that whatever state Russia is going to be in, it will feel that it suddenly needs to change its long-standing positions on issues which are very fundamental to Russian security. But that at the same time is not to say that Łukasz is not correct. There are all of these initiatives that continually come forth, which on the face of it seem reasonable and seem constructive. In fact, the only thing I'd argue with you there, Marcin, it's not a new normal. It's just normal. It's just another of these processes that continues apparently unaffected by the current situation. And I think we can expect them to continue afterwards as well, related specifically to Ukraine, or in fact to all of the other domains that Łukasz mentioned. But there is a key caveat, which Łukasz, you mentioned only in one of these cases, but actually applies to all of them, which is when you unpick the detail, these are not constructive solutions. These are things which play to the substantial disadvantage of the West and are in fact Russia maneuvering for greater advantage and constraining its adversaries while it itself remains free to act. In exactly the same ways all of the ceasefires that have been drafted in Moscow and then imposed on the victims of Russian aggression, whether it's in Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, etc. So if we take the examples of the initiatives that Łukasz has mentioned, and the incidents that they are supposed to address. You talked about aggressive air maneuvers. You mentioned specifically the P-8 being boxed in by Russian fighters. There's a whole raft of dangerously stupid or stupidly dangerous actions in the air by Russian aircraft, for which Russia puts forward a proposal. Well, let's have some kind of regulation. Let's have a commission to look into this. The aim, of course, being to persuade Western nations that the best way to prevent these incidents is to move them further away from Russia and therefore to constrain the West. But the correct way to deal with it would, of course, be Russia instructing its airmen and seamen once again to observe those regulations that are already in force and which its unprofessional behavior is completely disregarding. We don't need a new set of safety rules when there were ones which were perfectly fine until Russia decided to disregard them in order to make a point. Similarly, on open skies, of course, Russia wants to stay in open skies because it reaps so much benefit from it, because other parties to the treaty are keen to continue observing its terms, whereas Russia is perfectly willing to put restrictions saying, no, you can't fly in this area or that area, or if it does find that a flight is incoming which wants to look at a part of Russia which it does not wish it to, then it's quite content to, at the last minute, cause air traffic control to reroute that flight over somewhere totally different with 10/10 cloud. So it gets the benefit, but at the same time, it's constraining other actors. And you mentioned the initiative, the MIR initiative, saying to NATO, well, you just stop your activity in Europe and we'll stop our activity close to the border. But of course, there's all of the rest of the Russian landmass where it can carry on. So the essential caveat behind all of this is that, yes, it looks perfectly reasonable. It looks constructive, as Łukasz said. And the problem is that, particularly when it comes to situations like Ukraine, you will find Western politicians who are quite happy to sign up to these things because it gives them an easy life and because it is harder than actually dealing with the fundamental contradictions over situations like Donetsk and Luhansk.
Okay, thank you, Keir. You actually did something what I also thought you would do, and I would like all of panelists to do so. Basically, react also to what you have heard, to what you argued. So, any reaction to what Keir said, or to the question about frozen conflicts, Łukasz, Anna? Anna, please go ahead.
Okay, maybe just a reaction to your question about what Russia will go, what will be the Russian politics towards, how to say, CSTO countries, the countries abroad. I mean, first of all, post-Soviet space, but not only. Keir also mentioned Syria. Probably we also have to mention Libya, which is also a very interesting case nowadays when we observe what is going on there. But starting with, how to say, post-Soviet space, because for Russia is still very important, and we still have to mention that Russia perceives it as a part of the Russian world, something which is in Russia called Ruski Mir, and which is very important both for Russian security and foreign policy, which is combined with each other. So I don't see that Russia will change its policy towards especially Ukraine, but also Georgia. The more that last couple of days ago, we had an information that Ukraine was given a special partner status from NATO side. So probably it also will cause some reaction from Russian side, and I don't expect any changes towards Donbass, what is going on in the so-called People's Republic. The second issue is, of course, Crimea, and as Łukasz mentioned, and as I told you before, I'm pretty sure that a huge part of this year drills will be taken there, just to present the strength of Russia and to show that no one will be able to get back the Crimea. It's the second issue. Russia will also try to use all kinds of frozen conflicts. Russia will also try to use probably the weakness of Central Asian countries because of the pandemic, because of weak economic situation. Russia still will be very active in Syria because for it is very important place to be, and moreover, even we can hear the rumors from last weeks about Russian jets which was found in Libya, if it was those ones who are operating in Syria or just the old Libyan equipment. And Russia is very visible in Libya, even if it's not officially there, even if officially the private military group was withdraw from that place. I'm pretty sure that they will interfere on that. We also have to take into account one thing more, which Keir a little bit mentioned during his first presentation, that Russia will also interfere in the politics, will interfere in all kind of social sphere and all kind of problems, which probably partially will be caused by the pandemic. But also we have to be very careful about plenty of elections which will go on, not only the US presidential elections. I totally agree with Łukasz that it will be very crucial for Russian foreign policy. Also, one thing which we didn't mention is, of course, the New START treaty and the negotiation that Russia wants to prolong the treaty. It's very important, and we'll try to do this. And second issue, there are plenty of parliamentary elections within Europe, for instance, in Lithuania, which can be also very important for us. And I think that Russia also will try to interfere in Ukraine politics and Belarusian one, because we will have also Belarusian presidential elections in August. So definitely Russia wants to maintain its position in something which it named the close neighborhood. We almost don't use this term, but just speaking from Russian point of view, from the point of view of a country which is thinking in a way of the sphere of influence, that the globe should be divided on that. Thanks.
Yeah, let me jump in on this, and I can't really. I didn't think that I would want to say it twice, but let me say it once again. Russia is not the source of all evil in the world. It's conducting a policy that is detrimental to our interests in all the places that Anya mentioned, and some more, and kind of both internally and externally. That's thing that I strongly disagree with. But at the same time, if you look at various conflicts in the post-Soviet space or in the broader world, there are more actors involved there. Some of these actors either don't listen to the Russians, or in some cases exploit Russians for their own benefits. You look at Syria, and the question is who is exploiting whom, and this question is also being asked increasingly in Russia, and I see a number of articles in pretty mainstream internet websites asking what are we doing in Syria? Why are we in Syria? Some of them noting that the ideas that this is a wonderful training for the Russian armed forces, even if there was something there, it's already over. We tried everything that we wanted to try over there. If it's supposed to be the kind of showcase for our weapons for export abroad, then everybody who wanted to show to see them in action already saw them. If we wanted to go back to the Middle East, here we are. But in the meantime, we got so many problems at home. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Our regions are, and healthcare is underfunded. So why are we still there? And I think when kind of more details about the extent of the Russian support for the Haftar forces in Syria come to light, there will be similar questions. The same about any support for Venezuela and other kind of more exotic locations. And I fully agree that there are some things that Russian are so important for Russia that you won't see major changes. Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, when I think it's very interesting that right now President Lukashenko is actually saying that some of his opponents in the presidential elections are sponsored by Russia. But I think there might be an interesting interplay of different interests and different groups when it comes to engagement in the more far away places. And I don't see it as certain that the proponents of keeping or extending the footprints in places like Middle East, Africa, South America, they will prevail.
Thank you, Łukasz. Actually, you have all touched the issue which prompted questions from the audience, and the issue is about Russia in the world, so to say, in its direct neighborhood and farther beyond. So we got a question from Maciej Puchowski precisely on Belarus. So Maciej is asking, what is the future of Russia-Belarus relations after the pandemic, and is it possible that Russia will move on to kind of incorporate Belarus or propose something deeper, like a confederation union, to quote Maciej? And I guess that this is mostly a question which could Anya tackle, but before, but of course you can also jump in. But before I will give the floor to Anya, then let me also ask another question from Thomas Wilkins, who is asking about Russia and its role in China, India border spot. So I understand that basically the question pertains to more to the issue, which is now also hotly debated, of the Sino-Russian alliance in the making, so to say. Is there a prospect for this relationship becoming a proper alliance in the post-pandemic, so to say, world in the Russia, which will have to change at least maybe a little bit some of its vectors of the foreign policy? So how about we start with Belarus and Anna, and then any of you gentlemen, if you could just jump in, then it would be great.
Okay, so thank you, Marcin, and thank you all for questions. Starting with Belarusian issues, you know, the situation is very difficult there. I mean, still the pretenders to have a status of the candidate, because we have very complicated registration in Belarus. One of the main is now today was taken to jail. So it's also very strange, the situation. But definitely the whole story between Russia and Belarus is very complicated, and started to be very complicated last year when both countries were discussing the deepened integrational program, which was backed by Russians, who wanted to, how to say, a more integration with Belarus, but Belarusian authorities knows very well that if they agree to that, and they didn't agree to sign this plan, this program, will mean that they have to implement plenty of Russian regulations, and they probably will lose a huge part of their own sovereignty. What will be the future of these relations? It's very difficult to say because there are two crucial points. One of them, there are presidential elections. If there be any crash caused by some human rights issue, that, for instance, but there will be some pacification of demonstration in Belarus, and it will ruin the relations with Western countries, I mean the EU and the US especially. It will weaken the position of Belarus, and moreover, Belarus will be hit by the economic crisis very seriously. So if this very pessimistic scenario comes, we will have the situation where very weak Belarusian authorities will have to ask Russian authorities, Russia, for support. And it will mean that then Russia definitely will use this situation. So probably we will have to keep our fingers crossed, nothing to happen during the parliamentary elections. And one thing, my quick reaction to Łukasz said, I also totally agree that Russia is not a main sources of everything bad and every kind of evil in this world. But the main problem, I think, that we will have with Russia, that there are plenty of spheres when probably we can maybe not to cooperate, but let me put like that, even to cooperate, even to influence some spheres, even including Arctic, including some other places of the world. But the problem is that Russia, being an aggressor, I would say, put it like that, stops us and prevents us for thinking about its position as a good negotiator, as someone with whom we can cooperate and with whom we can agree on something.
Thank you, Anna. Now we are left with the Sino-Russian relation and the alliance in the making. Keir, would you like to comment on that?
I can briefly, but let me just throw one more thing into the mix on Russia-Belarus. The part of the question was, might we see something closer to a confederation or union between the two countries? Let's not forget that on paper, they've already got one. And that's just a demonstration of the difference between declaratory policy and actually what happens on practical terms in the relationship between the two countries. Now, I'm afraid it's a theme you've heard from me before, but I also think that in terms of Russia-Belarus relations, because it's been a stably unstable relationship for so long, it is not the pandemic and the results of that would make a change. It would have to be something which is far more fundamental in terms of how each country treats each other. For example, if Russia were to decide that it needed to ensure the correct result in any of the Belarusian elections and therefore intervened in order to ensure it, that is the kind of thing that might prompt a serious reassessment of how exactly these two countries have been getting along or not getting along, depending on which topic we're talking about over the last 10 or plus years. So I think there it's a continuation. It's more of the same. Some problems exacerbated by the current coronavirus situation, but not a game changer. And I think it's a similar situation with China and Russia. There, the term that we heard was alliance. I think that's unlikely to be a word that we will see used by either side, not only because of Russia's traditional insistence on its own status as a great power, which means by their definition, that no, you don't need alliances to get done what you need, but also, why would China wish to entangle itself in all of the arguments that Russia has with its neighbors and with countries further abroad? China has its own aspirations for cementing its own place in the world order, whether it's post-pandemic or not. Russia has very different ideas about how exactly it wants to play with the rules-based international order. The two are compatible in some domains, but they're not so compatible that they would actually be able to compile a formal alliance, as opposed to simply cooperating publicly or covertly on those areas where their interests do in fact happen to coincide. So yes, there might be a close relationship, maybe never as close as Russia would like to pretend that it is, because of course, as soon as Russia admits that there's any problem with China, that causes serious problems, as opposed to the constant pretense that the West is a hostile power seeking to attack Russia. There's no mention of any potential drama in the future relationship with China. But that is as far as I think it will go. I believe there will be certainly a confluence of interests in some domains, and deconfliction which goes with that when both countries are seeking to expand their global interest without actually treading on each other's toes, as far as we can see. But as for formal alliance, I think not. But I'd very much like to hear what Łukasz thinks on that topic as well.
Well, let me start with this, and then we can move also to the triangle Russia, China, India. Actually, let me do a little bit of kind of shameless promotion of the Institute, because we have recently published a pretty big report, which basically looks at the question that may appear strange, but at first, but please bear with me. So the question was, can Russia and China cooperate to hurt the European Union? So can this cooperation also turn less than beneficial, not from the security viewpoint, but also from other viewpoints? And we started with our own take on the state of Russia-China relations. And we decided to call it a de facto alliance, or sui generis alliance, because it's not alliance in the classical international relations definition, where you need to have a common enemy and ideally also a casus belli. But it's as close to an alliance as you can get, and we we looked into various elements of the cooperation, and you might call Russia a junior partner, but this cooperation is growing in the economic sphere, in the energy sphere, also in the military sphere. That the Russians, for example, are right now selling to the Chinese the type of equipment that they weren't willing to sell 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And also, if we know in the open, President Putin said that there is a cooperation in terms of the early warning system, and Russia transferring some of its knowledge to China. This is pretty sensitive stuff that doesn't happen if you are just partners, but it's still not there. And we see all the limits also of this relationship in the latest crisis at the China-India line of actual control. Because exactly as Keir said, that why should China be entangled in various problems that Russia may have? Right now, we see the opposite question: why Russia should be entangled in a conflict between its almost ally, China, and its very, very close traditional partner, India, where the relationship goes way back to the Cold War era, when there are also, interestingly, the aspect of military cooperation and selling of equipment to both China and to India. So, so far as I can understand, the Russians quite wisely are saying that, of course, they are concerned, and of course, they are calling for de-escalation, and they are very much for the diffusion of the situation, but they're also saying that both countries should basically manage this issue between themselves. So you can see them trying to distance themselves, as far as I can understand, from taking sides, and also not really that much interest in playing a role of the mediator. Probably they see it as just too complicated and too risky to be drawn. But it's interesting that so far we thought, okay, it's mostly the question of the Chinese unwilling to support Russia on things like annexation of Crimea. But right now we see the Russians that are having some second thoughts about this. They might also have some second thoughts about the future of Russia-US confrontation and their role in it.
Thank you, Łukasz. You mentioned India, you mentioned China, and indeed we have touched the relations with the perspective Russia's relations with major powers, but we only kind of scratched the surface with regards to US. We mentioned the New START treaty and the need or the expectations of Russia that this will be prolonged for a number of reasons. We mentioned barely that, of course, the outcome of the November presidential elections in US will be a factor, but can I just encourage you to dig deeper there? So basically, we have two scenarios: more of President Trump, so this re-election, or President Biden, a Democratic administration now, likely to change a number of policies introduced by Trump. So depending on these two scenarios, I know it's far-reaching, but this is the Russian-US relation is one of the factors which determine the security and of the transatlantic area, at least. So if you could just look very briefly on these two scenarios and say how Russia may accommodate to either Trump staying in office for another 4 years or to Joe Biden taking over White House for the Democratic Party. I don't know, Keir, would you like to start?
Yeah, certainly I can have a go. But as you say, there are so many unknowns there, and a very limited amount of firm data from which we can actually start to project. One of the biggest questions and problems that would determine the course of a Biden presidency is the extent to which he can undo the damage that has been done by Trump, and the extent to which Trump has met so many long-standing Russian foreign policy objectives in such a short time. So many things that Russia wanted the United States to do, and has wanted the United States to do since the 1950s, but which were beyond their wildest policy expectations for so long, and to what extent the damage might actually be irreversible. Now, some things it might be easy to slow roll until a Biden presidency arrives. For example, this threat of reducing the number of US servicemen in Germany, which, let's not forget, primarily is a spoke in the wheels of EUCOM and AFRICOM, not actually German security, because of its the enabling role of most of the US servicemen stationed there. Things like that are relatively easy to arrest, but the overall corruption of the whole of the U.S. administration and government, and the imposition of Trump appointees in positions which actually favor Russian interests would be a far harder thing to reverse, even before you start on undoing the damage in U.S. society as a whole. And all of these provide wildcards, provide vectors which Russia might or might not in the future be able to exploit. A Trump presidency, on the other hand, has its own wildcards, as we can imagine. That there's the overall trend of implementing wherever possible policies which are to the detriment of the US alliances, to the detriment of Europe, and actually favor Moscow. But every so often there are wild flashes of something unpredictable as well, which might cause Russia to have second thoughts. For example, when you do order airstrikes in Syria in response to actions there, which comes completely out of the blue and a total surprise to Russia. So I am not in the habit, unfortunately, of making bets on this kind of thing, and least of all which way the election might go, because of this entirely unpredictable dynamic in US society at the moment. But the key point, as far as I'm concerned, is Russia has made so many advances in the relationship over the last 3 years that whatever happens at the end of the next presidential term, they're still going to be in a more advantageous position than when Trump arrived in power.
Thank you, Keir. How about Anna? Would you like to comment on that?
Very, very brief issue. I think that Russia wants much more from Trump than it achieved. So it's one thing. Second thing is that we don't know if really Joe Biden won't have any, so to say, agreements with Russia. How the U.S. policy will look like when if he wins. What will be the US policy, especially towards Ukraine, but also Eastern Europe and the places which still, as I mentioned, Russia perceived as its sphere of influence. But I will try to focus on something which is very specific for Russia's policy. Nowadays, when we look at Russian TV, at the news, we will see all this information coming from the US and presenting it's almost as a failed state, when everyone can beat the police, when everyone can burn the cars, the shops, and so forth, so on. And it is present like a total difference with Russia, which is tackling very well with the pandemic. Where everything is fine nowadays, when everything is calm, and Russian media tries to present the whole story in the US as a total mess, and said that as a matter of fact, the American authorities are very, very weak and they cannot deal with the situation in the country, which is very interesting because, as I mentioned, I think that it will be a part of Russian interfering in American elections, and it is a part of how to say, Russian policy towards its own society. And one thing, probably it's not connected with that, but rather with information, maybe not warfare, but policy of Russia, which we didn't touch during this conversation. There are the changes in Russian constitution, and one of them is that they want to put a point that it's forbidden even to call for changing the borders, but not to annexate something as some entity, but Russia should stay at least on its border what it has now. So it means that probably every kind of pro-Ukrainian movement in Crimea will have serious problems, and Russian authorities are showing that they that they will tackle with that kind of situation with every possible issue.
If I can just add a couple of points. I mean, the Russians seem to be not the only ones that have troubles with understanding the Trump administration or the US approach. Because on the one hand, you have the president who is apparently under a strong feeling of admiration for strongmen like Vladimir Putin. And each meeting that he had, bilateral meeting, Trump, Putin, were always these worries about what exactly would happen and what they would agree on. And of course, there are a number of things that if you sit in Moscow, at the United States, and a weakening US leadership, you're actually quite happy about it. But at the same time, they are looking at some of the actions and they see, until recently, strengthened deterrence potential in Europe. They see the delivery of weapons to Ukraine, including lethal weapons. So I think they have troubles understanding what's going on. But as far as I understand, the level of ambition regarding the US-Russian relations on the Russian side is pretty low. I think that most of the experts, at least, they see the United States having a strong bilateral position, which is critical of Russia and would remain critical of Russia. And even if they thought that Trump would change something, there is the deep state in the Russian narrative that prevents him for doing for improving the relationship. So I assume at the same time there are still a number of topics in which the two countries traditionally cooperated. And arms control, strategic arms control, is one of these topics. Actually, next week, there'll be hopefully the first serious focused discussion about prolonging the New START treaty in Vienna. So there is an agenda there for the time between now and February next year. Whoever wins the elections in the United States, starting when things stopped in arms control, so either resuming the negotiations or starting the negotiations anew, would be a natural way to keep this discussion going. And we have to remember that the United States and Russia are still the countries that have more than 95% of nuclear weapons in the world. So we also have a little bit of interest in them talking to each other.
Martin, if I may, just one quick footnote to what Łukasz has just explained very, very clearly. In some cases, there's a perfectly simple explanation for why there is this apparent disconnect between Trump policy and the actions of the US government, particularly on reinforcement of Europe. And again, it is processes that were underway before something changed. It's processes that were put in play before the arrival of Trump. Now, on the bookcase behind me, there's a book about Russia with the dedication in the front. It says to all those US government civil servants who are trying to create a sensible policy on Russia and deliver it while hoping that President Trump doesn't notice. And that's exactly what happened with things like European Reassurance Initiative. Yes, the generals in Europe were saying, watch what we do, not what we tweet, because they had not been interfered with. But when they are, we see things like, for example, funds being diverted from European Reassurance Initiative to pay for the wall. We see the threat of the drawdown of Germany. So it is when the lighthouse light of Trump attention lights upon it that we have a problem. And until then, the deep state, those parts of the US administration and government that are functioning sensibly, continues to do their job. I think that's one of the roots of the disconnect, but it may, as Łukasz was suggesting, it may be one that is not that comprehensible in Russia. Because let's not forget that President Putin, like Trump, always looks for those one-to-one agreements. He seeks personal relationships in order to get things done, and then is frustrated when the personal relationships are with individuals who are at the heads of liberal democracies or supranational organizations that work by consensus, and therefore they can't deliver on what Putin thought was agreed because they are from a democracy. I think we see the same process happening here now on bilateral US-Russian relations. Back to you, Marcin, excuse me.
It's fine, Keir. That was a very needed intervention. Now we have around 15 minutes or less left. So how about we move with the final question from Wojciech Lorenz, analyst here at the Polish Institute of International Affairs, who asked about the influence of the pandemic and the current social and economic situation in Russia and its prospects on the Putin regime and on the governance system of Russia, basically. And I would like to build on that question. I would like us to end on a note, which again is very, very complicated, but at the same time, the key issue in our deliberations. So basically, can the pandemic, can the situation in Russia change or lead or be one of the factors, and I'm very careful on purpose here because we don't want Russia to experience a lot of death and economic devastation following the pandemic. Obviously no one wishes that to Russia, but can it be a factor, the situation which is happening now, with also the changes in the constitution, with the social changes happening in Russia? We've seen some protests around the proposals regarding the constitution, although very shy protests and protests which have been cracked down quite effectively, or the protesters rather than big protests. Basically, are we seeing Russia moving a little bit towards a regime change, and the regime change which would mean more secure Russia, more transparent Russia, Russia which would be less of a threat to its neighbors, or is it still more of the same, what we can expect? How about we do it in the reverse order? So I would like Łukasz to start, then Anna, and we will end up the entire conference with Keir. Łukasz.
I'll be very careful with the words regime change on a discussion which is moderated by the Polish Institute of International Affairs, because I can already see the headlines tomorrow in Sputnik or any other media, if they are listening. Hello. But kind of what we are, I think, talking about here is the opinion polls. Levada Center, they note the drop in support for President Putin. The drop is to the level of 59%, which is quite high in any other country. But even before the COVID pandemics, the sociologists were noting this feeling of exhaustion and the feeling that the model, the Putin model, has reached its limits, and nobody really knows what comes next. And people want some kind of change, but they don't really know what kind of change. So that's one thing. The second thing, it's not going to be a great piece of foresight, but let's see what happens between now and July 1st in terms of how people actually react to the victory parade or parades and the attempt to mobilize the society to go out and vote and support these changes. It's not just July the 1st, but there is this a couple of days of early voting. That would be a good indication of how things work. And then if the kind of if the politics in Russia is restarted, then we might talk about the Duma elections that people were discussing before COVID, which would be another chance to see what's the mood of the society. So let me stop here.
Yes, and I have to jump in on the regime change issue. Of course, what I meant is not any external action, but basically internal reform of how Russia is governed, a reform which comes from the people and from the politicians and is under the full control of the Russian nation. And that was my intention from the beginning. So now, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcin. Coming back to the question about how to say, maybe not the regime change, but the presidential change, which almost, maybe not everybody, but plenty of people was expecting last year. I think that something happened between December last year and January this year, because if you think about the huge press conference of Vladimir Putin from the middle of December last year, he said that he doesn't want to prolong his term, that he won't jump to the next elections and so forth, so on. And just a month, more or less, after, it occurred that they find out that it's possible to change the constitution, and it's possible to give him the possibility to compete and to be the president for at least a couple of years. And it's very also interesting because I also mentioned one paper by Vladislav Surkov, one of the, how to say, spin doctor of Kremlin, who published the paper last year about Putinism without Putin, and he has written there that even without Putin, the whole system will survive. Then it was also very interesting because in this midterm between December and January this year, Surkov also has resigned from being an advisor to Putin. So probably he can maybe feel offended that still it will be Putinism with Putin, not without Putin. But still, I think that the Russian how to say regime has a serious problem with any other leader. So this is the first question, and that's why I think that we will have Putin for at least this couple dozens of years in the future, if nothing unexpected, of course, will happen. Of course, people have enough of him, and we have plenty of even, how to say, mimic videos when someone put the picture of Putin to the left in one of the blogs in Moscow, and the reaction of people said everything about how what they think about him. I won't quote because it's before 10 p.m. So that's why it's we cannot say what ordinary Russian people said about him. But I think that still the Putin is needed there, and even if Russia will have to tackle with serious economic problems, and will have to tackle with healthcare, social issues, and so far so on. It won't. It will hit the regime if there will be if Russia will be a democratic country. As it's not, there won't be any changes there. But it doesn't mean that Russian authorities won't change anything. I think that they will try to. Probably it may be that they will try to find out a common enemy just to consolidate the society and to rise the popularity of Putin and his regime. But we shall see. And you know, this last thing we said that Russia is not the only evil in this world, and we have one more problem with Russia, that both very strong and very weak Russia will be also serious problems, and will cause serious problems for us as a transatlantic world, but probably the whole world. Thank you.
I think Anna is entirely correct, and it's striking that I have no shortage of colleagues, both here in the UK and in Europe, who will routinely predict, as they call it, the demise of the Putin regime, which is their name for the system of government and administration in Russia overall, even under far more benign circumstances than we have at the moment. And they seem very disappointed when, in fact, the Russian government doesn't fall and chaos ensues. It is true that, as Anna says, pending anything unexpected happening, we shouldn't expect change. Well, we have had something unexpected happen. We've got both the constitutional tinkering and the pandemic happening at the same time. So it is an unusually strong challenge to the legitimacy of the current government. But it is not such a strong one as has historically caused Russian governments, whether post-Soviet, communist, Tsarist, to change. The system is usually more resilient than that. Of course, when the breaking point comes, it comes suddenly and unpredictably. But we see at the moment a government which is preparing for any of those kinds of challenges to its legitimacy. The whole construction of the National Guard, for example, to deal with any manifestations of public discontent. And it takes a lot more discontent than what we've seen evidenced in, for example, reactions to pictures of Putin in a lift to actually bring about that kind of response from government. It takes a lot more than simply being fed up and exhausted of Putin. It takes active anger on a wide scale to try and bring about that kind of change. So yes, I do not see the current situation as being sufficient to cause anything more than the kind of tinkering with the system of government and the kind of search for unifying factors that Anna has already referred to. I don't see it as bringing about any major systemic change that is not in fact initiated by the Russian government itself. And I see we're very nearly out of time so much, and I'll hand back to you right now.
Thank you very much, Keir. Thank you all. You have been really disciplined. So we kept the time given. It's 2 minutes to 5:30 when we are supposed to stop. So let me just say thank you very much, especially warm thanks to you, Keir, for finding time in these busy days of plenty of webinars and conferences. So thanks for finding time to talk to us, to talk to our virtual audience here today. I think we have not solved the question, the problem of how will Russian security and foreign policy look like in the next coming year or two, but we definitely untangled some of the key issues. And for that, I'm very grateful to you, Keir, and to my great colleagues, Anna and Łukasz. It's been a tremendous debate. It's been rich and to the point, and you have been, as I said, disciplined. So your interventions were brief and crisp, hence easy to listen. And by saying that, I encourage to visit this conference on the PISM YouTube channel. It will be available soon, once recorded and digested by the internal mechanisms of YouTube. So, and please do visit PISM YouTube channel. Please follow us on the social media channels. Please check our website for information about conferences or seminars like this one, but also check it up for new pieces of our analysis. With this, thank you once again. Goodbye. See you on another occasion. Have a happy and nice afternoon. Bye.